Welcome back to Down to Earth. I'm Melissa.
And I'm Caleb.
And we're really excited to have you guys join us once again here as we hang out with Uncle Marty. Welcome, Uncle Marty.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here again.
We're excited to hear whatever story it is you have to share with us today. It's a little bit daunting, I think, for all of us because this is our last episode for the season, isn't it?
It is. It's
kind of hard to believe, really.
It's been a very fast and a very long journey at the same time, and I'm kind of sad to see it end.
Yeah, me too.
So as we dive in, Uncle Marty, I've got a question for you. I'm heading to a Christian college here, coming up pretty soon, to kind of spend some time there with the kids, doing some music and speaking with them, and speaking to them, rather. And I was just wondering if you had any tips on how to inspire young people for God, how to kind of spark some interest.
Yeah, inspire people to want to follow God.
That's a very, very good question. I think it's a multifaceted answer, and maybe we'll look at more specifically some of those parts. But I would say, first of all, somehow we have to ignite passion in people's hearts for God, for something greater, for their communities. And I think one of the very core things of all this comes down to people understanding what is your destiny, what were you designed for, what were you called to do. And I think that every single person on this planet yearns to do something of meaning and be a person of meaning. Besides whatever 9-to-5 job I have, whatever I do, people just have this longing for greatness.
We want to almost be like the heroes of our own story, as it were.
Yeah, I think we all have that, and I think until we really find out what that calling is, what were we designed to be, we don't feel complete fulfillment in our lives. And what I see is as people come to understand their design, what God has made them to be, all of a sudden you start seeing movements happen. Because people are now living to what they were designed to do in a godly way. Now you can use what you were built to do to lead towards darkness or to lead towards light. But as more and more people understand, this is what God made me to be, then I see that movements really start to happen.
So how do you hone in on that? Because at least for me, how do you know what it is that God wants you to do? How do you know what your purpose is? How do you know how to even start? I mean, as we've gone through, we've talked about multiple things, but you've talked about how to find people of influence and start movements that way. But when I'm the person, as it were, who's found, or I'm the person who's trying to help start something and really show others my passion for God, how do I know that I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, or this is my destiny, or this is my purpose?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that we start looking at several different factors in our lives. What are my things that I like to do? What do I find fulfillment in? What am I good at? So, for example, in your case, you are good at music. You were born with that. You asked me if music, I like to listen to it, but I can't even keep a tune, It's just beyond me. I am just like tone deaf, but I love music. So you're born with a special gifting. So then you already know, okay, music is good for me. I feel fulfilled. I can serve God through music. You like helping people. And you take that out in helping people in your nursing career. But I think that we start asking questions, what talents do I naturally have? What gifts has God given me? So coming back to the music, for example, are people inspired when I make music? And so I see that these are questions you start saying, what are my talents? What are my gifts? What are the circumstances in my life that God has set me up? Like you mentioned Pastor Moon, he put a lot of time into you back when you were a pre-teenager. And so these are things that you see God start setting up, a series of events that leads you. Like in my own life, I see God led me this mentor. So he put me in touch with many people that were beyond my control even, but they made significant influences in my life. So you start seeing, what are the talents I have? What are those special gifts that may be beyond me? But like I remember, I used to do a lot of preaching. I'm not a good speaker, but when I'm speaking for God, something comes upon me and I'm almost a different person. I'm not that shy, timid person that I just like to sit quiet in the living room and not be bothered. So that's a gift for me. It's not something that comes natural to me. So talents, gifts, what are those unique circumstances of your life? Something that I learned from the Mennonites, they ask, what do you have in your hands? Meaning, what are those talents? Like if you want to go into business, they ask, what are those series of things that God, well, my family has this, and my friends have this, and if I borrowed from here, or I used my land here, and so you see what is around you. And those circumstances around you start to form. Now, I have a lot more experience working with people overseas than in a Western society. I've worked with a lot of Eastern societies. And something that comes to big play that I found is also your family circumstances. Not just what happened to me today, but I ask people to go back as far as they can and tell me their genealogy. What do you know about your families? Now, outside Western cultures, many people know for generations. And since, as we've talked in previous episodes, about finding people who have influence, many times your influence has been built over centuries or over decades or over several generations. And so, for example, it was very impactful for me to know that my great-great-grandfather, who came in 1640 to America, he came as a Puritan minister. He becomes a Sabbath-keeper in 1679. He calls his sons, his grandsons, his great-grandsons, and he makes them swear that they will keep the Sabbath throughout all their generations. And generation after generation, there has been Sabbath-keeping ministers in my family.
That's quite the legacy.
And so going clear back to that time till now, there's a long chain of people who have felt that to bring the Sabbath before the world is a very important and sacred duty. Now, not everyone has that experience, but you see what experiences is in your family. What is your genealogy? And many times that also shares because there's been blessings put on by ancestors. What has my ancestors also foreseen? And I think that's something we haven't talked a lot about as Westerners, but I think it does play a significant role.
Well, and you've talked some about community too, and trying to form a spiritual community that gives you support as well. And I know that at least as we were going to school, there was a huge wave of having people do like small groups to help provide some of that intimacy and also help you grow together closer to God. Would you say that makes a big impact?
I think so, because see, it's in a small community. If we look at how the early church exploded from 12 disciples to going from Scotland to India in one generation. It happened without paid clergy, without paid missionaries. It just explodes.
Without the internet either.
Without the internet.
It went viral.
Yeah.
It went viral without internet, without vehicles, people walking on foot.
That's really incredible to stop and think about that.
And as you look at the real power behind it, it is family, friend-based small groups. And it's in those small groups where the kingdom is lived out and where you really become accountability partners, but you also understand in a small group, you're each other's giftings and you push each other to live to the top of your giftings. So in the ministry we've been involved with, we have seen this viral growth. I would say one of these key things that have kind of gone through it is I have focused on finding those people of influence that we've talked about before, that then they start a ripple effect within their community. But one of these core things that have gone through it is, what is your God-given gift? What is your role to play? What are the things that God has brought so that you can bring God's kingdom within your sphere of influence? And that happens within a small group environment. I went to a Sabbath school here for 5 years and hardly knew the names of the Sabbath school members. We hardly knew a thing about each other. Maybe where we worked a tiny bit like that. But what I see happens in small groups that really makes it go viral, you're praying for Caleb. That Caleb will really be able to be the best musician he can be. So this is what goes viral, because now you feel you have a group of friends, family, that are really concerned for you.
You have support. You have people who are joining you on this journey with God.
Exactly.
Well, I know you've got a story to share with us. Does it tie into any of this at all?
Yeah, I have a story, and I think 2 stories to help really tie this up.
Okay.
And I'm always looking for people. I can't invest into a lot of people's lives, but you ask how this happens. How do you have a viral movement? How do you inspire? I used to do a lot of training. And in the training, there would maybe come 30 to 40 people 50 people, 100 people. I was looking for one person in those trainings that I used to do officially on behalf of the church. I'd look for one person from that 50, 100, 20 people that show up that I would invest time into on the long term. That one person there, he can then come back and change that larger group where you are to really start ministry, that one, two. So I look for people that I think are worth to invest in who can be what I call like keystone people. Keystone comes from the biological world, like wolves in Yellowstone. You reintroduce them, there's massive changes. You see the rivers change. They introduced wolves here in Collegedale area, and all of a sudden we saw coyotes come back in, because why? The wolves kill the deer, the coyotes now have a food source. And there's this whole chain of events that happen when you have a keystone. So I look for keystone people that really have a massive impact on the communities there. So I went with my wife where she did some training, and while we were there, there was a keystone person that I felt from the training that we were involved in. So I said, if we invest into this one person, and I didn't know all his circumstances, I felt he would be someone that would have an impact. I started talking to him. As I mentioned, I like to know a lot about people.
You always ask them for their story.
Always ask them. Well, within a few minutes of hearing his story, I realized, wow, this person is a keystone person. He's a person of influence. He has everything it takes to run a national movement. As I talked to him, I soon found out that he came from a very key family in his country. He was here in the States, lived 20 years away, and he came from a Muslim background. I started challenging, if you resolve the issues with your family, what would happen? He makes a decision to resolve those issues, and within a few weeks, he's having significant influence back in his family again. So I see that it's important. We use events to find 2, 3, 4. You try to inspire the masses, but then you find groups, and this is what I see Jesus does. He has the masses, and he has his disciples around him. And you look for those that you can really make an impact on.
So it's seeing people at large, trying to inspire everybody that you come in contact with to have a closer walk with Jesus, but keeping your eyes open for people that you can help mentor, or people that you can help just connect with and encourage. Because sometimes it's not that I need a mentor, but I need somebody to know that somebody's got my back. That when I'm making a journey with God, that somebody is there to pray for me or to just hold me up when I feel like falling.
And to catch a bigger dream. And I see a lot of times it's, wow, with a lot of the people I worked with, they had no idea, wow, God has put all these pieces together, and it takes an outsider sometimes to help you see this is what God's been preparing you for. So to get to our story today, I was sitting with, he's already been a part of our ministry for quite a while. And here, maybe about 3 years ago, I was sitting with him, and I said, brother, tell me about yourself. And he starts telling, well, my dad's a small business person, and so forth and so forth. And I said, already I know. And he says, well, you know my dad, he always likes to tell that their family have this milling business. And I says, but I want to know more about you.
I want to know your story.
I want to know your story. Start when you were a kid. Because I felt there was a very, very sincere, good person, and I felt he was a person I should really invest in. So he was silent a minute, and he says, well, my dad and mother had great dreams for me. And from the time I was about 11, 12 years old, my father was, besides the milling business, he was actually a religious leader. His real passion was religion, and he actually oversaw a large religious movement. And the business was, even though I talk about it, it was very secondary to our actual family life. And my father, actual vision for me was to take his place eventually as a leader of the section of the religious movement that we belong to. And his dream was that I would actually become a part of the national leadership of an international body of our religious affiliation within the Muslim world. It's a very large one. It's across many, many countries. And he said this was my father's biggest dream for me. And he actually instilled that very, very deep into my heart. And so from about the time I was about 12, he engaged me in everything. He let me lead local religious service. He took us through all the territory we work. We have about 500 towns where we have affiliations of our organization, and I would go around to all those with him. I know all these leaders since I was young. And then I would travel with him when they had national meetings. And my dad's dream was for me to know everyone in the organization, all the major movers and players, even the national leadership. And since I was 13, 14 years old, I would go every year or twice a year with him when they had their religious denominational meetings. And I says, wow, you have waited this long to tell me about all this? Well, he said, I didn't see it as very important. And I says, well, tell me, how did you become a follower of Jesus? He said, well, that's a good question. He said, because I grew up keeping Sabbath. I said, what? You grew up keeping Sabbath? As a Muslim? And he said, I did. I grew up keeping Sabbath, and my parents were very devout Sabbath-keepers. And I said, what? You never told me about this. How many years have we known each other, and you have never told me that you were a Sabbath-keeper? He says, well, that's what happened. And then he had some dreams and so forth, and he found out more about Jesus, and then he was amazed to find that the Bible supported the Sabbath that they had been keeping, and now he's just really...
That's got to be a little bit of a shock when you discover the Sabbath through your Muslim upbringings and you keep it, and then all of a sudden you're reading somebody else's book, as it were, and you're like, it talks about the Sabbath too?
Exactly. So he was shocked. He eventually becomes a Seventh-day Adventist. And then he moves and becomes a part of this underground home fellowship movement. But he had been estranged from his parents. And I said, you know, brother, everything you're telling me, God has prepared an incredible thing for you. He asked me, what do you mean? And I said, what I mean is, I see that God has prepared something incredible. You need to go back and put things right with your Father. What if He gives you back your whole spiritual inheritance? And then you bring everyone to Jesus in that whole movement. And he looks at me and he says, well, you think? I says, you need to go resolve everything with your dad and your mom. He says, you're right, because my dad is absolutely crushed. When I left, it just totally broke his heart, because his whole life had been dreaming of grooming me, and then I ran off. And I do understand that I didn't have to do that, but I just haven't known quite how to fix it. I said, look, brother, I'm going to pray that you can resolve the situation with your father. And not only that, he will be so excited that you come home, even though that you continue to be a follower of Jesus, that he will give you back the leadership. And he gets a smile. I don't think that's going to happen. I says, you know what? As I see things, this is the only thing that's going to happen. God has been preparing this not just for now, He's been preparing this for centuries. Because you told me your grandfather and your great-grandfather did the same thing. You're the eldest son. You're in line to inherit this. He says, you think?
You're good at guilt-tripping people, Uncle Marty.
Well, to make a long story short, he goes, he resolves things with his family. His dad is so excited. His dad says, you know what? I'm so excited, I'm going to make an early retirement.
There it is.
And there it is. He handed to his son his spiritual post of his section of the religious movement. 500 villages. Each village has between 400 and 600 members that already meet in small groups, already all prepared. And so you know what he's been doing? He comes and he makes the following challenge to them. He already has almost all of these turning towards Christ. If you do the numbers, it's a very significant amount of people. But he started by saying, why do we keep Sabbath? He says, well, it's our tradition. The Quran says so. He says, would you like to know more about this? Of course, please. And he has these big public meetings with them, brings them all together. Did you know that it's really God's most sacred day? And he starts, because the Quran does hints at it, but now he builds it from the Bible. God created the earth in 7 days and rested. It's at the very heart of the 10 Commandments, and so forth and so forth. Even Prophet Jesus kept Sabbath, and people get all excited. And to make a long story short, now he has hundreds and hundreds of families, not even hundreds, it's now into several 100,000, because if you do the numbers, he has about 500 villages, each one between 400 and 600 people who are now following with him through this. As we continued to talk with him, I challenged him, you know what, brother? Look at this. You are already a respected religious leader. you need to think bigger just in your own group. This country is organized through different Muslim religious associations, but no one has kind of brought them all together under one umbrella. What if you bring them out under all one umbrella? He says, well, everything you've said so far has proven true. Let me try. Well, he's just about organized all the religious associations in the country, then this umbrella that they come together to pray, to plan, to strategize for themselves. He now has significant influence. The vice president of his organization in their country, they believe there's somewhere above 15 million Sabbath-keepers within their organization. And the vice president has already become a follower of Jesus, and the two of them are dreaming how they can bring the whole organization to Christ within their country. And so we've just seen God work in a very, very powerful way. He hadn't seen all these pieces together, but by coming in and saying, see how God has been preparing you. Look at what he's done with your father. And now his father is so proud because his father's become a follower of Jesus, his mother's become a follower of Jesus, and the father says, wow, I never dreamed what would happen. The time I invested into my son, he is now being recognized as one of the most influential religious leaders in the country. And who is he doing it for? He's doing it for Jesus, that he brought me to the feet of Jesus as well.
Yikes. Well, I guess I have one question for you, Uncle Marty. I guess not all of us feel, because I can only speak for myself, like keystone people. I mean, I have a legacy. I'm very proud of my legacy, but it's not something that I necessarily sit down and think about how I can be a mover and a shaker like this young man is. So how do those of us who feel more like everyday Joe Blows fit into this great plan of God and still be able to inspire people so that we don't have to be a TV preacher or a leader of hundreds of thousands of people who are following Jesus? Like, how do I just, as I am at work, how do we find that comparison for those of us who aren't like that?
Well, I think that we all have a calling wherever we are, and that's a good thing. And I don't want people to think that to follow God or to do it, you have to be someone like the story I've just told. I have a good friend who lives right here in this community. He and I used to work together overseas, and he was a plumber by trade and a maintenance person. And I learned so much from him of how to be a kingdom person, because I had never thought of being a kingdom person in all these trades, but he kept saying, you know, Marty, I'm a minister being a plumber. And I says, what do you mean? Share with me, Mike. And Mike says, well, listen, every job I do, I want to honor and glorify God. And I can tell you story after story. He says, for example, I get a lot of people call me with impossible things to do humanly. So he said, for example, there was an old lady. She was living on a small pension. She had a well, and the pump had fallen at the bottom of the well. So it had totally stopped up. Several people and other plumbers had already charged her hundreds of dollars trying to pull it out. They had given up and said, you have to drill a new well. That's going to cost you $9,000.
No.
So he says, this is what God has called me for. It brings me great joy and satisfaction. Yeah, I could have made a pile of money. Say, hey, she calls me, do whatever you need to do. I knew she didn't have the money to do this. So I just knelt down right there beside that well in that old pump house and said, Lord, you're the creator of the universe. You know I'm a simple person, but I trust in you. I'm going to put a wire at the end of my rope, and I'm going to pray that I'm going to put it down. You know I'm very busy. I need to feed my family, but I also want to bless this lady. She can't afford a $9,000 new well.
Yeah.
Can you just drop this down and let me hook this pump at the bottom of the well, 150 or 120 feet below?
Yeah.
Does his prayer, drops down, plays with it for about 15 minutes, hooks the hook on the pump. Somehow his hook catches it and he pulls it up, uses the same pump. She had bought another pump even, to not knowing what had happened, used the same pump that had fallen, fixed it up, put it in, gave her a bill for 25 minutes work.
Jeez.
And he says, for me, that's being a minister. That's my calling. God brings me great satisfaction and joy being a plumber, but I'm a plumber for Jesus. And I think that whether you're a plumber or you are a stay-at-home mom, God has called us to do great things. Because I'll tell you, Mike, and a shout out to you, Mike, if you ever see this, may God bless you abundantly, because you don't know the impact you've had in my life. And that story and many others like it that you shared of what it means to be a minister, being a plumber.
Well, thank you for that story, Uncle Marty. It's kind of inspiring, just being reminded of every spectrum of how we can do great things for God. Maybe as we close out this season and this time with our audience, that we just take some time in prayer, asking God to help us to remember to make our lives all-encompassing for Him, so that we can inspire people like you're going to do in a couple of weeks, and so that we can be ready to be those people, those lights that draw people closer to God. And also for Mike and this other young man whose story you shared today, I think we can pray for them that God will continue to use them in their ministries as well. You want to close us out, Caleb?
Sure. Let's bow our heads. Dear God, thank you for today, and just thank you for the season and for the time that Uncle Marty and Melissa and I got to be here together and just hear these incredible stories and get to know how you've come down to earth to make a difference here in our lives. And even if we're not called to be keystone people, God, you do still have a plan for each one of us and a specific purpose in your will and in your kingdom. And so I just ask that you'd open up our eyes and ears and show us how you'd want to use us, and just humble our hearts and allow us to be used by you. And thank you for hearing and answering our prayers. And please come soon and take us home with you. In your name, amen.
Amen.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here at Down to Earth for Season 1. And we'll look forward to seeing you next time at Season 2.